Hello, this is some old guy in Hawaii, and Picard Season 3 premiered on February 16th and wrapped up April 20th, 2023. Since then, I have done exactly one video on the series, and that was about why, in very broad terms, it makes so many people happy, but not me. Okay, about how the level of storytelling just didn't meet my expectations. Since then, I have agonized over how to address the actual problems in detail because the issues I have are legion. And every time I sit down to document them and review the episodes, I see more stuff. Breaking it up thematically kept involving going over the same material more than once, and an episode by episode breakdown would take forever, averaging at least an hour for each, if not more. Not prepared to do that. So, we're going to approach this from a big picture perspective. I'm going to lay out what I realize is the overriding issue and explain that first, because it finally occurred to me that that drives everything else. Then, if I feel like it, I'll hit some of the related details in subsequent videos. But before I get started, let me make it clear that there are things in Season 3 that I like, things that I think are well done. The acting and character work in particular are first rate. The entire cast, old and new, are all at the top of their game. And any issues I have with their performances stem directly from the writing, not the actual acting. Videos singing the praises of the season, however, are everywhere. More balanced critiques of the show are much harder to find, which is why we are here and why I'm going to be mostly negative. Okay, I am going to get down. Am I going to get down the weeds? Probably, somewhat, but hopefully always in support of the big picture issues. So, what do I mean by ends justify the means? The Season 3 writing staff set out to do some very specific things. One, reunite the Next Generation main cast 20 years after the fact. Two, put them back on their old ship. And three, have them save Earth, the Federation, the galaxy, the day, whatever, one more time. Those were the primary goals. Almost everything in the story, plausible or not, depending on your point of view, was designed to make all that happen. You can guess where I stand on that. I not only find the way these things came together really far-fetched, I find the goals themselves individually to be wildly implausible. We're only going to cover the first two, but that's plenty. Saving the day can be addressed everywhere else in separate videos. Let's take a look at the first two. So, how do the original 7 get together? Well, Beverly starts off things by sending an SOS to Picard, a man she hasn't seen in over 20 years. That's who she picks. But she's injured and under the gun with limited options, so we'll give her that. Not sure how Picard's old comm badge still works after 20 years, or how a coded subspace message addressed to Admiral Jean-Luc Picard goes only to that comm badge, the badge last assigned to one Captain Picard, but we'll go with that as well. Okay, in any case, when sending the message, she encodes her actual location, but then utters a single word, Hellbird, that she should know Picard himself does not understand, but she implies is important. Then she tells him no Starfleet and trust no one. Okay, her actions imply she expects Picard to contact someone who might know what Hellbird means, which he does. But the person he does in fact contact is Riker, even though Beverly said no Starfleet. Picard, by the way, does not tell Riker about no Starfleet, only that she said trust no one, at least on screen. Okay. Yes, he and Riker have kept in touch and seen each other in recent years, but she said no Starfleet. Apparently she or the writers didn't mean the old TNG crew because, well, that's what the show is all about. So those people, even if they are still part of Starfleet, are conveniently exempted. And Riker conveniently knows about Beverly's code because it directly references the time when Picard was Locutus of Borg. Per Riker, a Borg computer virus scrambled the Enterprise navigation system and arbitrarily added 3 to all coordinates. So Riker adds 3 to each of the coordinates provided by Beverly, and the location goes from the middle of nowhere to some place that makes more sense. Okay, this is a reference to events that supposedly occurred off-screen in the TNG 2 part of the Best of Both Worlds. It's new information. It's created for the series, and doing that kind of thing is fine. It looks like clever plotting, but there are problems. Okay, first, the Borg never went in for computer viruses, and in the episode, they constantly demanded Enterprise escort them to Earth. Messing up the navigation system would only delay that. Okay, second, Picard would know about any Borg virus implemented while he was Locutus. Of course, if the virus was implemented after Picard was recovered from the Borg cube but still incapacitated, he would not know. Also, even as Locutus, he might not know the actual name or nickname, Hellbird, given to the virus. But as Picard, he would eventually find out. That sort of thing will be written up in official Starfleet after action reports, which he, as captain, should have read later. Okay. And last but not least, what if he didn't go to Riker or someone else familiar with the incident? Best case scenario, it takes him longer to find out what it means. Worst case, he goes to the coordinates in the middle of nowhere. In both cases, Beverly dies and Jack is eventually captured or dies as well. But I'm getting off track, okay, delving into more logic holes that don't directly influence how the cast comes together. The point is that Beverly contacts Picard, and that's fine. But she also tells him do not do something he almost has to do if she wants him to find her. And Picard does just that by contacting Riker, who conveniently solves the problem. A lot of the writing in this show sets up rules or guidelines and then casually violates them. Okay. In any case, if we're okay with Beverly reaching out to Picard, which makes sense, and Picard reaching out to Riker despite warnings, these three are not a big problem. Character-wise, they make sense. And with Riker, we more naturally get Deanna, although not officially until episode 6, I believe. That's how we get 4 of the 7. And truth be told, it's fine. I can overlook the logic holes. I actually did it first. Most people won't even see them on first viewing. That was me as well. The other 3, however, are much more problematic. Okay, first is Worf. Roll Iron apparently employs Worf to investigate what turns out to be the same issue plaguing the other 4 from a different angle. Why him? I understand he's outside of Starfleet at this point, but why him? Why Raffi for that matter? Why is it that the only 2 people she has investigating are TNG and Picard regulars? Because they are TNG and Picard regulars. That's the reason the same can be said for 7 of 9. I'm okay with these 3 being in the mix, but also being key to moving things forward with no one else involved is a little far-fetched, okay? Then we have the bizarre case of Data, or Data Plus, if you will. Starfleet, or Section 31, apparently chose an unstable, unpredictable AI to handle automated security and inventory management for their most powerful tech at their most important classified facility. And that just happens to be this data lore, etc. hybrid nobody else knew about. Okay, and he's not good at either task. The place got broken into twice in the exact same way 6 months apart, so no changes were made in those 6 months, and he failed to notice or at least notify anyone that a particular piece of inventory, Picard's body, was missing. But of course, that's not the point. The point is to get Brett Spiner and Data back in the mix, even though we've already killed Data off in the past twice. Then there's Geordi. Okay, why Geordi? Because they need a place to hide the Titan, and Picard suggests the Fleet Museum, which just happens to be run by Geordi. And again, we ignore the no Starfleet rule, even with Beverly present, because it's Geordi, and no other place comes up. Okay, and why is Geordi running the museum? Why is he not captaining a ship exploring or doing cutting-edge engineering research or holding some senior position given his 30-some-odd years of service? He's supposed to have been running this place for 20 years. The timelines are not clear depending on how things are dated, but at one point late in the series, Geordi mentions restoring the D for 20 years. The implication is that this is what he's been doing for 20 years. Now, at least he's achieved a rank higher than any other TNG alum except Picard, although Commodore as a rank, permanent or situational, has never been consistently explained or used in Trek. But unless a career in Starfleet is drastically different from anything in human history, holding the same post for anything close to 20 years does not reflect well on one's career. Overseeing a museum, however great that museum, especially given his experience and demonstrated talents, also does not reflect well on Geordi. Of course, the reason he's been doing this for 20 years is because the writers started a convenient way to get him back into the mix without really understanding or defining military service and career or how museums work. We'll get to that, even in the 24th century. That and because Picard chooses to seek him out in particular. So that's how the 7 get back together. And to be honest, the only one I find totally beyond the pale is Data. But that doesn't change the fact that the bringing together of these particular 7 after 20 years feels contrived in almost any situation. The only way it might make sense would be via Q, but that again is a character that's been done to death. Geordi, however, is also key to the most preposterous return of all, that of the Enterprise D. Now, recovering the saucer section from Viridian 3 and transporting it to the Fleet Museum is fine. Mating it to another engineering hull and restoring it is fine. That's what museums do. Everything else about the D in this story, however, is various levels of ridiculous. First, Geordi mentioned spending 20 years restoring the D. Now, I assume he doesn't mean by himself, which would be ridiculous. Staff, volunteers, and others would have to have contributed thousands of man-hours. But he doesn't say the museum has been restoring it, which is kind of odd. More importantly, he reveals this information and the very presence of the D at the museum to the rest of the crew and the audience at large as some kind of surprise. This is insane. Okay, the recovery and transport of the saucer section to the museum would have been a major piece of fleet-wide, if not Federation-wide news. It would have been common knowledge and heavily reported. Additionally, the presence of the D, even as it is being restored, is a major museum draw that should have featured prominently in museum public relations. We have the D. Come watch us restore it. View it from all angles in galleries around the hangar bay. Take small shuttle tours for a closer look. Watch live feeds of restoration work. Come learn all about its history. Anybody who understands how museums work understands how big a deal this would have been. And yet when Picard and company show up, no one else is shown, staff or visitors. Did they just happen to show up after operating hours? My impression is Geordi lives there. Wouldn't other staff live there and be present as well? All this kind of stuff is never addressed, and the D is somehow a secret. Okay, but it gets worse. Museums normally take one of two approaches to items in the collection: preservation and or restoration. Preservation involves preserving something in the state in which it was found. If an item is so deteriorated that restoration may be impossible or even harmful, preservation may be the way to go. Some things are also preserved in a particular state for historical reasons. Think damage from a significant historical battle, for instance. Okay. Restoration involves restoring a piece to a configuration that closely matches how it existed at some point in its past. Restoration involves obtaining or fabricating replacement parts. A good example of this in Picard Season 3 itself is the bridge of the D. A lot of fans have noted that the bridge shown is that of the television series vice the first theatrical movie, although TV series bridge itself changed in subtle ways over the course of 7 years. An in-universe explanation might be that the latter configuration was heavily damaged during the crash on Viridian 3, and the museum decided that rather than trying to restore it up to that setup, they instead opted to restore it to look as it did for the majority of its service life. Maybe they had access to a spare bridge from another ship being scrapped. Lots of possible reasons, you get the idea. Restoration, however, is a relative term. The ability of a museum to restore a vehicle to full functionality depends on the vehicle and vehicle type in question. Old cars, for instance, are much easier to get up and running than airplanes, but it still depends on the age and type of car. Older, rare automobiles can take an awful lot of time and effort to do that. Airplanes, most of which are larger and more complex than automobiles, require more effort. Very few are restored to and maintained in a state that would allow one to fly them. Okay, there are museums that do that. Planes of Fame in Southern California, for one, though they don't try to do that with everything in their collection. And then there are individuals and outfits like Tom Cruise and the Commemorative Air Force that maintain and fly vintage aircraft for personal pleasure and or in air shows. Okay, if you can afford to do that, seeing vintage aircraft in flight helps inform the public in a way that static displays do not. But these are exceptions to the rule. Okay, restoring and maintaining aircraft in operational condition is expensive and time-consuming and requires that we fire up the engines and actually fly the aircraft on some regular basis. Most aviation museums don't do that. Naval museums are a whole nother level of cost and complexity. Most historic naval vessels are museums themselves that sit pierside and don't go anywhere. Their engineering plants are complex, potentially dangerous affairs that require serious tweaking and monitoring in order to operate. The engineering and weapon systems of most historic naval vessels are not maintained in a functional state. I know of only one historic naval vessel that actually gets underway on a regular basis, and that's the USS Constitution, which is a sailing vessel. Starfleet, though, in the 21st century probably has a lot more resources at its disposal, especially if it can establish a large museum home for dozens of large starships. But again, this is a museum, not a mothball fleet with older ships actively maintained in various states of readiness that can be put back in operation quickly in response to an emergency. These are museum pieces open to the public. And yet I'm expected to believe that a 20-year-old Galaxy class sitting in a hangar has been restored to and maintained in a fully functional state. It can fly and fight after all that time with the press of a few buttons. And on top of all that, Geordi did a whole lot more than preserve and or restore. He made major modifications, which should be a museum no-no. How do we know this? Because this vessel can somehow power up and be flown and fought with as few as 3 or 4 people. Okay, he somehow automated it to such a degree that it can dispense with the entire engineering crew and God knows who else. Okay. Now, some people will say Scotty did the same thing in Star Trek 3, and they're right, but only up to a point. That ship was not sitting in a hangar for 20 years. It's plausible, although weird, that the engineering plant, the warp core / reactor, was still up and running while sitting in space dock, and the ship had been fully maintained right up to the point Kirk and company stole it. Also, while Scotty was able to automate the controls, taking the automated Enterprise into combat, something Scotty tells Kirk and company that he did not expect to happen, overloads the automated systems with the firing of a single torpedo. Shields can't be raised, and the entire system goes down after a single hit from a Klingon torpedo. This even though, per Krug himself, Enterprise outguns the bird of prey 10 to 1. Okay. Understand, it's not that the Enterprise couldn't fly and fight at that point. It's just that it couldn't do so with only a handful of people on the bridge. There was no one in engineering or elsewhere at that point to push the right buttons or turn the right levels or whatever to keep the ship operating. Geordi's restored and modified D shows no such limitations. This is either ridiculous or amazing. Okay. If the latter, it would be a huge technological leap. Starfleet would want to know all about technology that would allow them to drastically reduce the size of the crew complement on their largest vessels. But Starfleet doesn't know. The Titan crew has over 500 people. Okay. But let's pull back on the two most important issues. The restoration of the ship to fully functional capability, power, propulsion, weapons, etc., and the extensive automation of these things. Okay. Why would a museum need or want to do either of those things, especially the modifications? Okay, the simplest and easiest answer is it wouldn't. The only way to go through this ridiculous song and dance is to put the original TNG cast back on the ship and go fight with it at the end of the series. Okay, it's putting the cart before the horse, and it's silly. Could the writers have come up with a more plausible setup? Maybe. I can think of at least one more plausible way, although again, that has already been done to death. Q. But I don't really know, and I don't really care. For me, trying to do all this in the first place is a dumb idea to begin with that smacks of fan service wish fulfillment. And the way it was done, especially with the D, only emphasized that. There is, however, one more facet of this ends justify the means story we need to hit. That's the idea of fleet formation, which, as Admiral Shelby says, is, quote, synchronistic technology that allows every ship in Starfleet to operate as one, an impenetrable armada, unity and defense, the ultimate safeguard, unquote. It's a line of sight system that when activated links every Starfleet vessel together under one unified automated command system, a system that when activated cannot be overridden by the crews of the affected vessels. Okay. Why would one need ships to operate that close together? And why would one ever implement a system that could not be overridden by the crews of the affected vessels? The vulnerability of such a system is obvious, and that vulnerability is exactly the thing that happens in the show. This is basically a variation on the Cylon network intrusion plot utilized in Battlestar Galactica, albeit taken to an absolutely ludicrous extreme. And why only line of sight? And why would the Borg need to take advantage of such a feature if they've assimilated the crews of each ship? Okay. The entire setup is a really wonky, stupid idea that only exists to allow the TNG crew to get together on another ship, an older one not part of the upgrade, one that Geordi even says is more analog, even though that's not what analog means in this context. And that ship is, of course, the D. Two last points. One, Geordi mentions automated loading of weapon stores onto the D, basically torpedoes. Why is live ordnance being kept at a museum? Two, if we're going to fight the Borg, the D is not the ideal choice. That would be the Defiant, smaller, easier to automate, newer, and purpose designed to fight the Borg, and sitting right there. Okay, so that's my rant. I find the entire baseline idea of getting these particular 7 people together on this particular vessel after 20 years to save the day, not just a bridge too far, but several bridges, especially given the way it was actually done. The willingness, the desire to reunite the old cast on the old ship undermines most of what I see as poor writing choices in these series as a whole. It also informs the enthusiasm of so many fans for the show. See my last video. If this story works for you, I'm happy for you. You like what you like, and no one can tell you otherwise. But it doesn't work because it's a well-told story in the best traditions of Star Trek. It works because we want it to, and because we consciously or unconsciously overlook all the holes. Okay, I'll go into more detail in a future video too. In the meantime, tell me what you think. Am I being too harsh, too nitpicky? I love these characters and their adventures as much as anybody, but it takes better storytelling than this for me to buy seeing them again in this way. Stay safe, and thanks for watching.